Welcome, AP Psychology students. Mr. Dowell here on a snowy afternoon, sitting in my classroom with a nice bottle of Mountain Dew and thought I'd crank out some videos for you. So this video is going to introduce Unit 14, which is social psychology. So we'll kind of introduce it a little bit and then talk a little bit about attribution theory. Fascinating stuff. So for those AP testers, this is a pretty big unit. 8 to 10%, so it's one of the bigger ones. Difficulty level, I don't think it's too bad. People usually do pretty well with this unit. There's a lot of terms, and a lot of the terms kind of sound alike. There's a lot of terms with the word social in it, so you got to kind of keep those separated, but most people enjoy this unit and do pretty well with it. Very applicable material. You'll see this stuff a lot. After this unit, you'll say, oh my gosh, I see this everywhere. And like I said here, it's one of my favorite units of the class, probably my favorite unit of the class. That being said, when we say social psychology, what are we even talking about? Well, it says the scientific, psychology, we're trying to be a science, the study of how people's thoughts and feelings influence their behavior towards others, and how the behavior of others influences people's own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So, that's a mouthful. There's a lot to unpack there, but we'll get into lots of different dynamics, like what makes us conform to other people's behavior? Why do we obey authority figures? What happens when people get into groups? Like, what kinds of decisions do they make? What things do they do that are good? What things do they do that are bad? And then also things like prejudice, discrimination, group conflict. And so all kinds of really, really interesting stuff here. But basically, how does the presence of other people affect us as an individual? How does our presence affect other people? And so there's a lot of crossover here with sociology. The big difference would be that sociology is more looking at the group, and then psychology more of the time is looking at the individual. How does the individual behave and think? But there's definitely, some crossover here. So that being said, the big topic here is attribution theory. So to start, we're looking at how we perceive each other. How do I explain your behavior? How do you explain my behavior? And it's just some information to kind of preview this. One, you've probably been told in your life, oh, you only get a chance to make a first impression, and it probably sounds like, it's blown out of proportion, but the research actually says that first impressions actually are very important. People tend to give more weight to first impressions and early impressions than they do to later ones. It takes more late good impressions to overcome a early bad one, if that makes sense. So early on, we're really forming our schema, our concept of what that person is. And so you do want to make a good first impression. So getting into this term attribution, so it's the process we go through in our mind to explain the causes of behavior. And we have attributions that we make for others' behavior and also for ours, and they can differ depending on who we are looking at. But they all kind of come down to a few different types. I guess I should note here too, these are important because they help us understand people's behavior, or at least try to understand them, and then try to predict people's behavior moving forward. But again, the two main types of attributions. You've got what are called dispositional attributions. If you think of like someone's disposition, that's like how they are, like as a person, that's their personality. So who they are internally. So there's dispositional, and then there's situational or external attributions. So if we make a dispositional attribution, we're saying that the reason that person behaved the way they did was that's just who they are. So first day of school, someone comes in 5 minutes late, people might be likely, some teachers might be likely to say, oh, well, here we go, this person's going to be trouble. You make that early judgment of them. Whereas a situational or external attribution is going to be, oh, I wonder what happened that led them to be late. Maybe there was extra traffic, or maybe they got held up in the office, or there's it's not that person's fault per se. Something happened that led to them being late. So think about when you observe human behavior, what kind of attributions do you make? And do you think you tend to make more internal attributions, or do you tend to make more external attributions? And there's some research on this. And here's what we think we know. Most people tend to commit what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to over-attribute the behavior of other people to dispositional or internal. I'm just going to use internal and external from here on out. But we tend to use internal attributions of others. And then for ourselves, we tend to be more likely to make external attributions. So going back to the example of someone coming in late on the first day, more people would be more likely to say, oh, well, they're going to be judgmental and say, oh, well, that person, they need to kind of get their act together. Maybe they're lazy, maybe they're a slacker or whatever. But when we come in late, we have a good reason for it. We know what happened. And that's the big reason we're more likely to do this, is because we have more information about ourselves. We have very little information about that other person, so we just tend to lean internal. But for ourselves, we tend to lean more external because we know the entire situation that happened. And I would say, too, this is a big one, fundamental attribution error. Just if you can understand that people commit this and kind of go out of your way not to. And I try to do this as a teacher to kind of assume best intentions of people. If someone comes in late, I don't automatically jump to like, oh, they're skipping class or they're, whatever. And generally what you find is most of the time people have a pretty good reason. But learning about fundamental attribution error has helped me, I would say. And actor-observer bias is really a related term. It's just the added making the external attribution when it's your own behavior. So the fundamental attribution error is the one you make about other people. Actor-observer is the same, it just includes the external attribution about your behavior. You probably won't have a question where you've got to differentiate between the two of those. So those are two biases in attribution. There's a few more. One, the self-serving bias. This is the tendency that when things go well, we tend to make more of an internal attribution, or we take credit for it. But when things go poorly, we tend to push aside blame and take more of an external attribution. So here on the slide here, it says, I got an A because I'm smart. You take a test, you get an A. Well, I'm a good student. I know what I'm doing. I'm good at psychology. I studied really hard, and I'm a studious student. Whereas if you get a D on it, well, the teacher didn't teach it very well. We were super busy that week. There was all this going on. And we're not saying that that's necessarily wrong. It's just, what's the conclusion, the thought that you jump to in that situation? Do you make it more of an internal thing, or do you make it more of an external thing? Now, at first glance, you're probably thinking like, man, humans, we're terrible, right? No, this is not a bad thing within reason. And let me explain why. If you didn't have this, let's say it were reversed, what does that kind of sound like? If you get an A and you're like, oh, I'm so lucky, I didn't deserve that. And if you get a D, it's more like, oh, I'm such an idiot, what am I even doing? You know what that sounds like? That sounds like clinical depression. And so the self-serving bias is actually a pretty useful thing to give us a little bit maybe more overconfidence and to help us feel a little better about ourselves. If you didn't have the self-serving bias, you might be more prone to learned helplessness, and you might not be willing to take that calculated risk and to kind of swing for the fences, so to speak, or strive to be your best. So it does a nice job of protecting our egos. You just, be aware of it and don't take it too far. What else we got here? Oh, here's another good one. The just world bias. So we have this tendency as human beings to believe that the world is generally fair or just. So just in this context means like fair. We tend to think that the world is a fair, good place. And so because of that, our default, whether we're conscious of it or not, is often if we see bad things happen to someone, we think like, well, they must have done something wrong. We make that internal attribution of they must have done something wrong to deserve their fate or what happened to them. They deserved it. And we see this a lot with things like blaming victims. You see it when people are on trial for sexual assault and stuff, and they, what was that person doing? They should have known better not to go to that person's room or whatever. We look at poverty. What did that person do to cause their own poverty? We look at inequality. Why is one group lower than another? Well, that lower group must have done something. If they could have just gotten their act together, then they would be equal. So we have this way of blaming the victim. And people near the top of a social stratification are even more prone to this because they're looking around saying like, hey, society's pretty good. I'm up here, I'm doing pretty well. And so I'm a good person. I deserve this. I've earned what I've gotten. And just not being as willing to recognize that if we're being honest, the world is not always a fair place. But again, it kind of goes back to this idea of like, when bad things happen, I'm a good person. So if I just do what I'm supposed to do, then everything's going to be okay. Because only bad things happen to people who deserved it. So people fall victim to this one a lot, especially people who are higher up in the social stratosphere. Again, makes us feel better. It won't happen to us. So you could see how attributions affect our relationships. If we've talked about self-fulfilling prophecies. If we don't expect as much of other people, we're going to treat them differently. This is kind of a review from Unit 11. So if I make an internal attribution of you and I think that you're a lazy person, I might treat you in a way as a student that, well, I don't expect much of you. And in turn, you fulfill that prophecy by not working very hard in the class. Or I think that you're a rude person, so I treat you rudely. And in turn, you treat me rude back, and then you just confirm what I thought was true, whether it was correct or not. So to sum up, this is what you want to be able to do. You might want to pause it and take a second and make sure that you can do this. So our questions are, what is the difference between a situational and dispositional attribution? So situational is more internal. You're blaming the person. It's because they're lazy or they're not smart or whatever. Versus a dispositional, you're looking at the situation. So it's also called situational or external attribution. The person was late because of traffic or something out of their control. And then number 2, student bombs a test in psychology. Explain how the fundamental attribution would explain the teacher's perspective and how self-serving bias would explain the student's perspective. So the teacher, might look at the student and say, oh, well, first test, they bombed it. Maybe they're not cut out for this. They don't have the ability. And then the student might, if they're using the self-serving bias, would say, well, the reason I didn't do well is because the teacher didn't teach well. And they wouldn't go internal for their failure. And then we just talked about self-fulfilling prophecy. If I treat you like a troublemaker, you're more likely to act like a troublemaker. So hopefully that was a pretty good review. Feel free to bring questions to class, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.